Let me start with a very brief background on the benefits of such a crediting system. So we're talking about low carbon fuels, which can be an integral part to defossilize the transport sectors for various reasons. The first one is speed. So these low carbon fuels are available already today, and they can be used to address the urgent climate targets we have ahead of us. Secondly, for some use cases, for some consumers, electrification or hydrogen might be not a suitable option. So if you have such applications where there's a lack of alternatives, low carbon fuels can be the solution and can't be substituted that easily. Thirdly, you have acceptancy. So by allowing a continuation of internal combustion engines with low carbon fuels, you maintain consumer choice and also affordability of mobility and logistics, which is very important to maintain acceptancy of consumers for the challenges lying ahead of us. Then we also have a very important aspect, and that's life cycle. So currently regulation only looks at tailpipe emissions when assessing the CO2 emissions from certain technology options. But these technologies often lead to emissions in other parts of their life cycle, for example, at manufacturing stage, battery manufacturing for e-vehicles. And these are not considered, but if you look at the full life cycle, low carbon fuels perform very well and therefore should also be part of the solution. And last but not least, an unfortunately very current topic, and that's vulnerability. So by putting all eggs in one basket and selecting a single technology to address climate targets, we make ourselves vulnerable because we depend on a single technology and depend on a single energy carrier like electricity. And the attack on Ukraine by Russia shows us that this can be very risky and can lead to a shock to the whole system, very short term and unforeseeable. So why are we here? So what does the crediting system do? It combines two pieces of legislation which should go hand in hand to create efficient incentives for low carbon fuels. So on the one hand, you have the Renewable Energy Directive, or RED, which regulates the replacement of fossil fuels by low carbon fuels. And that targets the existing vehicle fleet only. And then on the other hand, you have CO2 emission standards, which regulate the development of the vehicle fleet, so addresses new vehicles. And the current direction of this is phasing out the combustion engine, which means that there is a lack of coordination between these two pieces of legislation. Because if you want to ramp up the use of low carbon fuels, we need to ensure that there are incentives to invest in the production of these fuels. And that's currently not the case. So the crediting system can be a solution to align these two pieces of legislation and provide the necessary incentives for more low carbon fuels in our system. Now, a very brief wrap up of the background to our proposal of a crediting system. So you're all aware that there is currently a review of the emission standards going on, and the European Commission has done a review and proposed tighter 2030 targets and a de facto ban of the internal combustion engine by 2035. On the other hand, the European Commission has also reviewed the possibility to include a crediting system, but has rejected this proposal. And we'll get to that also at the end of the presentation. So we have produced several studies on a crediting system. The first was for the German Ministry of Economic Affairs, where we produced a detailed proposal of such a crediting system, how it could be designed, kind of a proof of concept. And we also collaborated with a law firm, Flick-Gocke Schaumburg, who developed the necessary amendments to the legislation. The second study we produced was for Neste, where we looked more on the benefits and functionality in practice of such a crediting system. And the last study, that's the one we'll be also talking about today, is a critical review of the impact assessment by the European Commission, which led to the rejection of the crediting system. And we reviewed that critically, and in the end of the presentation, I'll hopefully convince you that the reasons are unfounded. Now, just briefly outlining how a crediting system would work. So it's a simple and voluntary system, which links two pieces of legislation mentioned before. So on the one hand, the Renewable Energy Directive, which targets fuel suppliers and governs the share of fuel supplies which have to be met with low carbon fuels. And on the other hand, you have the CO2 emission standards for new vehicles, which targets the car manufacturers or OEMs who have to reduce the average fleet emissions over time, which can be mainly done by either making vehicles more fuel efficient, which is very difficult since it's a very mature technology, or by selling more electric vehicles because they count as zero emission vehicles under that regulation, which only focuses on the tailpipe. The crediting system now combines these two pieces of legislation, and that's the only new part actually. And what it does is it incentivizes fuel suppliers to provide additional volumes of low carbon fuels. And additional is very important here because we want to ensure that we have a positive contribution to climate protection. But these additional volumes of low carbon fuels need to be financed somehow because right now they're still more expensive to produce than fossil fuels. So OEMs need to finance the extra costs of low carbon fuels, but get something in return. They get credits in return, which reflect the emission savings from the additional renewable fuels brought onto the market. And they can then use the credits to count them towards their average fleet emissions, so thereby reducing the fleet emissions and gaining that way. So two key properties of the system are the direct link to the existing renewable energy directive that includes the fuel definition, that includes the caps which are included there, and most importantly also the monitoring processes to ensure that everything goes according to the rules. And secondly, on the emission standard side, it would add a technology option which is currently not foreseen, by providing this possibility to also account for the emission reductions from low carbon fuels in emission standards. So what you see from this picture already is that it keeps the responsibilities for fuel suppliers under RED2 and OEMs under the emission standard separate, and also prohibits double counting. Now, going one step deeper in some of the design elements, but also only very briefly. So one key design element is to keep the system, the crediting system, as simple as possible and limit the administrative burden. And we do that by relying on the existing definition of low carbon fuels under RED2, and also building on the existing certification and monitoring processes which are already implemented today to ensure that fuel suppliers meet their targets. Secondly, we wanted to allow for broad choice for consumers and OEMs, and that means that the system is voluntary for OEMs, so there is no minimum quota, for example, for low carbon fuels OEMs would need to meet. And we also propose a specific way to use credits, and that's crediting against individual new vehicles, so effectively making them low emission vehicles despite being internal combustion engine vehicles. And in the regulation where only tailpipe emissions count, would today not be feasible as low emission vehicles. The third aspect is that we want to ensure that emission reductions are effective, so that there's a positive contribution to the climate protection. And we do that by first preventing double counting. So credits can only be used once, and the monitoring and verification systems are under RED2 are there to ensure that this is actually the case. And the second part of climate protection contribution is to require OEMs to front load credits. That means they have to submit or surrender the credits equal to the lifetime emissions of a new vehicle. So, and these lifetime emissions only occur over time, 10 plus years of the operation of a vehicle, but the emission savings would already occur before the vehicle is actually sold, because they would be captured in the low carbon fuels which are brought onto the market and used before they can actually be counted against the fleet targets. Last but not least, also a very important point, that's affordability of mobility and logistics. And we do that by, we facilitate that by allowing for a wide range of admissible fuels. So our proposal is to include all RD2 compatible low carbon fuels, subject to certain caps in RD2. But this allows to use the most cost-efficient fuels and don't restrict it to a certain type of fuel, for example. It's not a system only for synthetic fuels, it's broader than that. And we also propose not to link the country of use with the country of origin of the low carbon fuels. And that's also in line with the general idea of the emission standards, which are where you have a single European target and it doesn't matter where you sell the vehicles. So this is just kind of the proposal in a very, very short nutshell. Now going to the arguments brought forward by the European Commission to reject the low carbon fuel crediting system. And we believe, and we have shown in our study, that they are unsubstantiated and actually also contradict the stakeholder support from the public consultation. So the European Commission brings forward three types of counter arguments. So first, they allege that such a system would blur the responsibility between OEMs and fuel suppliers. But as I've shown you before, OEMs remain responsible for their own CO2 emission standards. They only get another tool for their toolbox to actually reduce emissions from their fleet. And that's a significant difference. There's also no double counting, so that there's no concern about kind of doing accounting tricks where you would apply 1 liter for both targets. That's prevented in our proposal. The second argument is that it would allegedly undermine the efficiency and effectiveness of the emission standards. And as we show in our study, the methodology used in the impact assessment is not sufficient to actually capture all the benefits from the crediting system. So we can't go into the details here, but just in a nutshell, the methodology doesn't capture the heterogeneity of use cases in the vehicles market, which is very important. So you can't look at a single use case or at an average number. You need to consider the wide range of applications today. Some might be more adequate for electrification, some might be less adequate. It really depends on how you use a vehicle. And secondly, the impact assessment doesn't consider uncertainty with respect to future battery costs. It considers only uncertainty with respect to future fuel costs, and that's also not adequate because until 2030 and beyond, there is still a huge uncertainty how battery costs will develop, which raw materials are available at which price, and so on. And this needs to be captured. And if you do that, as we do it in our study, you see that there are several cases where either option is more beneficial, electrification or using internal combustion engines with low carbon fuels. And it's actually also a voluntary system, which means that it's only an option. It would only be used by either consumers or manufacturers if it's actually providing the same service or reducing CO2 emissions in the case of OEMs at lower costs. And it will also ensure that we actually achieve our emission targets. Because if you have a broader set of options, obviously, if one is not available or not available at the cost you anticipated, you have an insurance because you can rely on a second option. And looking forward, it's also a first step towards a more holistic and resilient climate policy, because we are not just focusing on tailpipe emissions here. We are already expanding the perspective to a part of the life cycle, at least on the fuel side. in the longer term, if we want a resilient system, we need to expand that to other parts of the life cycle as well. So this would only be a first step, but it's an important step to take. And all these benefits I've outlined are not just theoretical thinking of us behind our desks. It's also reflected in the strong support for a crediting system in the public consultation done by the European Commission, which has unfortunately not been considered in the conclusion by the European Commission to reject that system. The last point is the European Commission raised is that it would increase the administrative burden and complexity. I can't deny that the whole system, the whole regulation is very complex, but it's already complex today. And the crediting system, it doesn't add much to that. So it doesn't add much in terms of administrative costs. And that's because we deliberately linked it to the existing regulation by, for example, relying on the already existing compliance and monitoring processes set up for fuel suppliers under RED2. And in the future, we also have a union-wide database will capture all renewable fuels, and that will help to further streamline the process. So if we focus on the additional administrative costs or complexity, this is not the case for the crediting system. So to conclude, we need a crediting system. We need more options as a first step towards a holistic, resilient, and more effective climate policy. The crediting system is simple and requires limited additional effort. It adds valuable options both for manufacturers and consumers. And it's an important step towards a more holistic climate policy for the EU in the transport sector. Thank you very much.